This is Success Stories, a program of the Sorrell College of Business at Troy University. I'm Alan Mendenhall, Associate Dean of the Sorrell College and Executive Director of the Manuel H. Johnson Center for Political Economy. Success Stories is a program that highlights the lives and careers of people who have accomplished great things. And I'm very proud to have with me today Dean Reuter from the Federal Society, who is a Senior Vice President and General Counsel for the Federal Society. And we're going to talk a little bit about his career and about his latest book, The Hidden Nazi. Dean, thanks for joining me today.
Well, it's great to be with you, Alan. Thank you so much for having me on the program.
So here's the book. Let's see if I can hold it up for the camera. The Hidden Nazi. I guess I want to ask you, first of all, who is General Hans Kammler?
Well, great place to start. He is the protagonist. He's the main character of the book. He's a Nazi thoroughly through and through, an ideologue. So he's not just a follower, he's a leader. And he's a Nazi general, an Obergruppenführer in their terms, within the SS. So he is as bad as it gets in terms of evilness. There was only one person in the final year of the war who became an Obergruppenführer, who achieved that rank, and it was Hans Kammler. He was, in short, the guy who helped make the Holocaust possible. He identified Auschwitz as the killing camp. He put the gas chambers and the ovens in. He then duplicated that work throughout the Third Reich at Sobibor and Belzec and Majdanek. So he was the one who provided the instrumentation of the Holocaust. A thoroughly evil guy. And then he went on to other things later in the war.
Well, and so the book is about what happened to this person. Yeah. There was a death certificate, but he allegedly was not dead, and there are all kinds of possibilities about what happened to him, and you sort of explore that with your co-authors. How did you come to this story? How did you decide to start writing about this and researching about this?
Well, if your viewers saw when you held up the book, there's three people on the cover, myself and two researchers and co-authors. One of them I've known from college, and he contacted me basically out of the blue about 15 years ago now. He had been researching this general, researching different stories of this general's death. They were inconsistent, obviously. If you get different factual accounts of how somebody died, something's going on. He's researching this general, and in his research, he finds our third researcher slash co-author, Colin Lowry, Dr. Colin Lowry. So I was approached originally as a lawyer by a friend to write a collaboration agreement so the two of them could share information about Hans Kammler. And that's how I got involved. But they started feeding me bits and pieces, describing just how spectacularly evil this guy was. That was easy to believe. But it wasn't easy to believe that maybe there was something fishy about his suicide at the end of the war, or that America had some involvement in that. And when they came to me, they didn't have the full story, but they had hints about it. And it was easy for me to be intrigued, given my family background. My family came here from Germany in the 1860s. So, during World War I and World War II, my family was on the side of the good guys, on the side of the liberators. But I still have this connection to Germany and this fascination with World War II. So it was easy for me to sort of get looped in.
Well, and what was it like to collaborate on a project like that?
Well, it was interesting. I mean, I call myself the principal author, which I think is fair. I wrote the book. But they did the mounds of research. They were researching this character for 10 years.
Wow.
And one of Dr. Colin Lowry's in Europe, Keith Chester's here in the United States. The research itself is just fascinating, the places you have to go, not just to the National Archives of different countries, but to small libraries, bases. Some of this information is at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, some of it in small collections and libraries in New England, but it's all over the world. And a lot of information we got through Freedom of Information Act requests, where you can't get access to the files of the FBI like you can at National Archives. You can't go in there and open a drawer. You have to make specific requests for documents and then negotiate the release of documents.
Was it surprising to you how much data was missing?
Oh yeah. Yeah, we had one archivist, Alan, who said, with regard to Hans Kammler in particular, it's as if somebody came in and cleaned up the files. And that really helps point, I think, pretty strongly, firmly, in the direction of a cover-up, not just a deal with the Americans, but later a cover-up. And it holds together because for 75 years, the world has believed this guy committed suicide at the end of the war. The Americans, we let the world believe that. But behind the scenes, we made a deal with him.
Well, it's a fascinating account. Again, the book is The Hidden Nazi. I want to ask you about your time at the Federal Society. You've been at the Federal Society how many years now?
That's not a clean answer because I was there for a year in 97, 98, then had a little interim period where I went back into the government, but I came back to the Federal Society in January of '01. So it's well over 20 years is the way I would answer that.
Well, the Federal Society is itself a success story. Why don't you talk a little bit about the Federal Society, how it was founded, how it came about, and sort of its rise to prominence?
Sure. It was founded in 1982 by a small cadre of law school students who looked around their campuses, and they were at elite law schools, Chicago, Yale, and decided that there aren't really any conservative voices on campus at the levels of the professors. So they decided to have a conference and invite some conservative and libertarian professors in to debate some of the issues of the day. This is 1982. They did that. It was wildly successful. They did it again the following year, again successful, because there was this hunger, this appetite on law school campuses for debate and discussion. At the time, there was this orthodoxy. It was basically a progressive orthodoxy, all pointing in one direction. And no real disagreement about that, no exchange of ideas. And that's what the Federal Society became, a forum for the exchange of ideas, where, and we've continued to do that over the past 40 years, bring people together to discuss important law and policy issues of the day.
And how did you find your way to the Federal Society?
That's a great question. You know, I feel blessed to be working at the Federal Society and to be working with my colleagues and the many volunteers and leaders we have. In law school, I worked at the Legal Services Corporation. This is during the Reagan administration.
And this is at the University of Maryland, correct?
I started at University of Maryland. I finished at Northwestern Law School in Chicago. And during my actually second, third year of law school, and then for several years afterwards, I worked for Legal Services Corporation during the Reagan administration. If you don't know what the Legal Services Corporation is, basically the civil side of the Public Defender's Office. And President Reagan wanted to zero fund the organization and couldn't get that done. So the idea then was to do some monitoring and compliance. Working there, I met a fellow named John Meyer, who's the brother of Gene Meyer, who is the president of the Federal Society. So working with his brother John, years later, he said, you ought to go work for the Federal Society, and that was that.
How about that? And you spent 2 stints within the offices of the Inspector General, correct? Was that before the Federal Society, or was that during the Federal Society period?
It was before and after.
Before and after, okay.
Yeah. So again, not a clean answer, but so at Legal Services, I worked in the Legal Services Corporation Inspector General's office for a while. Then I was in private practice. Then I worked for the Federal Society for a year. Then I went to a different Inspector General office for another small grant-making agency that operates AmeriCorps and Vista. That's how folks, your viewers would know it. And the IG's office basically patrols federal agencies for fraud, waste, and abuse. That's their mandate. And most agencies, even the smaller agencies, have their own Inspector General.
And so today you work with attorneys all over the country on a variety of different legal issues and projects. Tell us about some of those.
Well, so the Federal Society started out as students, and obviously those students, to their credit, they graduated, took the bar exam, and the Federal Society, with that cadre of people, began to grow. And we started a lawyers division that would host events and operate as a network for lawyers. And then we began to segment that in different ways. We launched some practice groups, 15 practice groups. So we have one that looks at civil rights, telecommunications, labor and employment, everything you can think of. Again, catering to the needs and desires of our membership. So my principal activity has been running those practice groups for 20-something years, after having run the student division briefly. But then in the more recent history, I've become general counsel, which this is the best organization in the world to be general counsel of, because as you likely know, if we have a legal issue, I just pick up the phone and call one of the best lawyers in the country that's practicing in that particular area. So, general counsel, from my perspective, is about issue spotting and then picking up the phone. It's a nice place to be. But we've developed over the years at the Federalist Society lots of special projects and initiatives looking at international law. So we have a presence in Europe principally, but Eastern and Western Europe now. A lot of emphasis on state courts, what's happening there, what's happening with state AGs and state SGs, what's happening in-house. We have a new freedom of thought project, which is looking at all aspects of cancel culture, whether it's in academia or business or tech in particular or the larger culture. So we have a lot of stuff going on. It's a growth industry at the Federalist Society, I would say. But we're always drawn back and see things through the lens of the founding, the principles of the founding, the ideas of limited government, free markets, individual liberty from a conservative and libertarian perspective. So nothing really controversial.
Well, where did you grow up, Dean?
Well, my dad was an Army officer. Both my parents were from Cincinnati. So
you moved around then?
I moved around a fair amount, probably not as much as some military brats. I was born in Heidelberg, Germany, which, because my father was stationed there, which gives me a further affinity for World War II and all things German, because I come from German heritage. And then lived in Texas, Oklahoma, but then primarily on the East Coast. By the time I was in third grade, my father was ensconced in the Pentagon at Fort Belvoir and then Fort Detrick in Middle Maryland, Frederick, Maryland.
And so what did you study in college before you went to law school?
Well, that's a great question. My father was a PhD scientist. He was not a soldier. He was not a guy picking up weapons and firing at people. But at Fort Detrick, that's famously where he ended his career, and famously an installation for biomedical research and bioweapons and chemical weapons. And he didn't talk about his work, but that becomes an interesting element of the hidden Nazi, because Hans Kammler ends up in charge of all the secret weapons, including chemical weapons and biological weapons of the Nazis. But he was a PhD, and my mother always wanted to be a PhD, I think. So she went back to school, got her PhD in psychology. I started at school, in a small liberal arts school in Frederick, Maryland, with doing psychology. And I did what I needed to do to get that degree, and then I quickly thought, this is not for me. So I got a double major in psychology and political science. And when I got into political science and took one class on constitutional law undergrad, I knew that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a lawyer, and I wanted to focus on constitutional law issues if I could. I had no idea that I would end up at the Federalist Society or have the career I've had. That's been good fortune, I'd say.
Well, I work with pre-law students pretty often. I've taken them on tours of the federal courthouse right down the street from where we're sitting. I've taken them through the Alabama Supreme Court and the other appellate courts, which are right down the street. I've taken them through the state capitol and helped them make decisions about whether or not to go to law school. I'm curious if you have advice to these types of young people who are considering law school, whether they should go, what factors they should consider in making that determination.
Yeah.
Do you have advice for those young people?
Sure. I think, it depends. First, if you can get an internship at the Federalist Society, that is a great internship in terms of clarifying whether you want to be a lawyer or not. I think you have to get a sense of what you want to do. Do you see yourself practicing big law at a big firm? Do you see yourself in academia teaching others law? Or do you see yourself in a small town hanging out your own shingle or being part of a 10-lawyer firm? I think each of those have different trajectories. If somebody sees themselves in a small law firm, I would say go to a state school, the best state school you can get into in law school. If you want to be big law, you've got to go to one of the top 50 law schools. If you want to go into academia, you've got to go to one of the top 10 or 15 law schools and do really, really well and get a clerkship ideally with a federal court judge. So we have a lot of interns, we have a lot of young employees. I do get involved in those conversations. That's my general advice, but it needs to be customized depending on what sort of vision people have. I still think it's a good time to be a lawyer, and there is an awful lot you can do with a law degree that you can't do without one, especially in Washington. And it's not all about practicing law. It's not all about being in a law firm. It's about public interest law. It's about being at the Federalist Society or Heritage or Cato. or AEI, or the Hoover Institute.
Well, I've noticed that the Federal Society is developing chapters on undergraduate campuses, and I went to a Federal Society event just down the road at Auburn University recently where Annie Donaldson-Talley, a mutual friend of ours, was speaking. That is a very interesting development to me. I find that fascinating. What prompted that change?
As we've grown larger rather, we've always thought about what more can we do, and we have chapters in every accredited law school in the country and then some. That's about 200 chapters. And we have lawyers chapters at about 100 of the biggest cities in the country. So we've covered the landscape there. What we haven't penetrated is folks at younger ages. By the time people come to law school, our thinking is they're not quite fully formed, they're persuadable, but it would be nice to provide some real information on ideas and debate and discussion at the college level. And I think everybody's aware that colleges now are as intolerant of debate and discussion as they have ever been. It's shocking to me. So we always wanted to be reaching a younger crowd, but the scale is daunting. There are 200 law schools. There are thousands of colleges and universities. And you lose some quality control. I mean, you can understand that if we're trying to manage 200 chapter presidents, they've reached a certain age, they're adults, they're reasonable, they have pretty good judgment. It's a larger cadre of people at colleges and universities with less judgment, less experience. So it's a bit trepidatious. But there's definitely a need to provide that sort of critical thinking and opportunity for debate on college campuses now more than ever. So
well, you probably know this, Dean, but we're going to host the first Alabama State Lawyers Convention, Federal Society Lawyers Convention in September of this year. And I think it's really important because we've had so many key figures of the Federal Society right here in Alabama. I know Judge Bill Pryor on the 11th Circuit, when he was Attorney General of the state, founded the Montgomery chapter. And the Montgomery chapter flourished for a while. And I actually took over the Montgomery chapter in June 2013, and I've been running it ever since, just about 10 years. But I know Senator Sessions has been very involved in the Federal Society and many others. And we have some federal judges on the 11th Circuit, Kevin Newsom, Andrew Brasher, who have been very involved in the Federal Society. And I'm wondering how many states have that sort of relationship with the Federal Society, and you work very closely with. I know there are different dynamics at play in a sort of fractured country at the moment, but you've developed great relationships with lawyers in certain states in particular, and I'm wondering what other states are like Alabama.
Well, Alabama's really strong, I will say that. And the idea of statewide conferences or regional conferences is fairly new. You mentioned city chapters here, there, and everywhere that do their own thing, but now it's become more fashionable, and importantly so, to do a statewide conference. Florida is the king of statewide conferences, Florida and Texas, I would say. Texas might not concede that. But in terms of the people that show up, Florida's pushing 1,000 people for their statewide conference. They're extremely strong. Texas is extremely strong. A lot of times it depends on the mechanisms of state government and the law schools within a state, and just basically the legal culture as it exists. It's very difficult for us probably to do a statewide conference in North Dakota, not because of the politics, just because of the geography. Difficult for us to do one in Connecticut because of the politics, probably, and a critical mass of aligned lawyers. But Alabama is, a top 10 state for sure, I would say, and very few have somebody like Bill Pryor in their DNA. Very few states do.
Well, and we have the good fortune of having warm weather year round, and if you're talking about a North Dakota, you have to eliminate several months from the calendar as possibilities for hosting those conferences.
Very true.
When you were in law school, what was your favorite subject?
Constitutional law.
Constitutional law.
Constitutional law. And I tell you, I got to Northwestern. I was in a seminar, and Northwestern is such an impressive law school. It's downtown in the Loop, but I had a seminar in the Wigmore room. It was the office of Wigmore. who wrote the textbook on evidence. They've got cases full of textbooks written by their professors. But I was in a seminar with Professor Michael Perry, and he kept telling us about the living Constitution. And I thought, I'm just a regular kid. I don't understand this. I can't make sense of this. I'm not smart enough. And then I realized this doesn't hold together as a theory. But I love ideas like that. I love hearing about things like that and trying to think about them critically.
What do you think the biggest change in legal education has been during your career? Would it be the rise of originalism and textualism as sort of operating principles?
I think that's the biggest change in the legal culture. That has permeated the practice of law and critical thinking and the way judges approach cases and the way people argue cases to judges. I'm not sure how much that's permeated the culture on law school campuses. I don't know if they're teaching originalism. I think they're going to rise to the level of educational malpractice pretty quickly if they don't, because the federal bench is dominated by people who do, by judges who do originalism. And you need to be educating people to argue cases in a textualist or originalist fashion. Otherwise, you're going to miss the boat. Setting aside originalism on law school campuses, I think the biggest change since I got out of law school in 1986 is probably an emphasis on clinical education. I came out of law school, I had never drafted an opinion, a complaint, a motion. It was all theoretical. There was no practical aspects at all.
I think you're correct on that. Even when I went to law school, which was later than when you went to law school, there were clinics, but they weren't so central or core to the curriculum. They were sort of optional things on the side that people would do. And I think it's a good thing now that students are learning how to draft pleadings and do basic things when they get out, because a lot of them, and especially here in Alabama, end up opening up their own law firms and hanging up shingles and doing the solo practitioner thing. And that's difficult to do if you haven't learned those other skills first. You'd
Right.
have to sort of apprentice under another attorney, even though you've already gone to law school, and it would seem to be duplicative, that you have to get an education, pay for it, and then go learn how to actually do the thing that you were supposed to learn while you were in school. And that would be doing students a disservice and forcing them to pay a lot for law school in order to just then go out and make a lot of hard sacrifices in order to learn what it is they need to do to become practicing lawyers.
Yeah.
I want to go one last time to your work in the federal government and ask you a little bit about that experience and what parts of the job, what did you see that you felt required some changes in the way government was working? I'm sure you saw, especially in the office you were in,
Yes.
many problems with the way government was working or not working, as the case may be.
Yeah, I think, and I actually wrote about this in a different book called Liberty's Nemesis, which focuses on the administrative state. I think when it comes to the administrative state, there's a fundamental design flaw. Congress gives outsized power to agencies, and the people working in those agencies, by and large, are people of good faith. They're trying to do a good job, trying to stay in their lane, mostly, not all. But even the ones who are trying to do what they're supposed to do, their tools within the SEC, it's financial stuff, within EPA, it's environmental stuff, within the FCC, it's telecom stuff. Their tools are to regulate and enforce, to pass guidance and regulation, and then go after people who don't measure up, and then to enforce, and then to bring them before administrative law judges that work within the agencies, and then to fine them, at the end of which, if somebody goes through that entire process, they can finally get to an Article III court. But by then, it's years later, hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, in fines that have accrued and legal fees. So there's a huge fundamental flaw there, and it's about separation of powers. It's the idea that agencies, they only do one thing. It's only in one area. So if you're working there, financial is the most important thing, or environmental is the most important thing. Telecom's the most important thing. We've got to step on the gas here and regulate. They pass the laws, they enforce the laws, they adjudicate the laws, that's a huge problem.
Yeah,
The founders, their heads would blow up if this came to their attention, I think.
They've basically become a fourth branch of government that is equivalent in power to the other three branches combined, and they each have their own sort of agency heads, which is the function of an executive. They have their administrative law judges and courts, and they have the judicial function, and then they have a regulatory function where they're promulgating rules and regulations, and they've got that sort of legislative function, but they don't have the same sort of accountability that's programmed into the DNA of the Constitution with the three branches. And so it's very easy for these administrative agencies to give rise to what we now call the administrative state.
Right. That's exactly right, and I'm glad you mentioned the accountability, because that's a huge aspect of what's missing from the administrative state. It's true that people can be fired, but it is very difficult to fire a federal government employee. I know an amusing anecdote, but the former head of Wage and Hour Division of the Department of Labor had difficulty firing an employee who was the getaway driver in a bank robbery.
Oh, wow.
And it was hard to get that person fired.
Well, I would love to follow up on that question and pursue this line of discussion more, but we are just about out of time. So I'll just have to say thank you for joining us. This is Dean Reuter. Again, his book is The Hidden Nazi. You can buy it anywhere books are sold, Amazon, publisher's website. Just Google The Hidden Nazi, you'll find it. Thank you, Dean, for joining me. It's been real fun.
It's great to be with you, Alan. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you. This has been Success Stories, a program of the Sorrell College of Business.